one of the advantages of a future that has less fossil fuel is that we'll be required to be more human, but part of the challenge is we'll have to start getting comfortable being around flawed human beings. And so one of the things that I talk about is we're all bozos on this bus. Let's get away from the idea that we have to be some high-level, perfect leader, high-level visionary, and let's accept the fact that people are annoying. And that's not a problem that people are annoying. The problem is that we expect that they shouldn't be.
This is Peak Moment. We are living at a peak of human innovation, information, wealth, and health. But we're also at a peak of population and consumption, with rising temperatures and declining resources fueled by cheap oil and gas. Peak Moment Television, bringing you examples of positive responses to energy decline and climate change through local community action.
Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. My guest today is Kathy McMahon, who calls herself the Peak Shrink. Now, what is that? What's a peak shrink?
It's a psychologist that works with people who first got a clue about peak oil, and they went through a whole lot of emotional reactions to learning about it, and they want to talk with somebody and they want to find out, are their reactions typical? Are they common? And what should they expect if they had it? It was a research project I started because I really wanted to find out what was normal. My own reaction seemed so crazy to me.
What was your reaction? We mean hearing the news about peak oil?
Learning about peak oil.
What was your own reaction?
I remember it like it was yesterday, actually. I had moved, we were putting in a new floor in our bedroom, so I was in a little room, and my husband would print out material from the internet, and he'd bring it into me, and he'd say, "Here, read this." And I'd read it, and I'd become increasingly like shocked and appalled, and then after I was just about finished with that, he'd bring in another piece and say, "Here, read this." And I was like completely overwhelmed. I was shocked. I couldn't believe it, and yet I kept looking for credible, skeptics that I could believe, and I couldn't find any. And so I noticed over time, I began to go through this emotional process of saying, okay, I have to collect food. I have to madly, I went through what I call a salad dressing period. I bought all the salad dressing. And then, a year later, I never used it because I started making my own salad dressing. But at the point, I just had to all of a sudden feel like I had to accumulate everything in order to be safe.
So you were accumulating, hoarding all this stuff,
Yeah.
because the world was going to,
Right.
The
I was
supplies,
expecting
the grocery
something
stores
dramatic to happen. Any moment, this big drama was going to happen.
I sort of had that same feeling when I learned about peak oil. It's like my first thought was, we're 6 miles from town. Okay, what if we can't afford the gasoline?
Yeah.
Should I be growing food? All of that kind of stuff.
And you had to do it all yesterday.
Yeah, because it's going to happen right now.
Yeah. So I started Peak Oil Blues because I basically wanted to see, did other people act like crazy? I mean, psychologists have a reputation for being kind of whacked anyway. So I wanted to find out if I was like unique in the population. And then I also wanted to really find out, what did people do differently once they found out? How did their life change? So it's been really fascinating because I've been doing it for 4.5 years. And what I've actually asked people who initially contributed a year later and 2 years later to write again and say, how has your life changed? And it's amazing that they have really made significant changes in their life that they consider to be really positive. So those initial periods, and I think one of the things I say is, don't make any major decisions about your life in the first 2 years after you find out about peak oil. Do the things that you want to do, but don't make any major transitional, I've got to move to the woods. I'll give you an example of that. There was a woman who wrote me from rural England, and it was a very early contributor, and she was describing the same fields that had been there since the Middle Ages around her, and the village where all of her family lived. And all that little village was all self-sustaining. And when she wrote me, what she said is, I got to get out. I got to go find someplace safe to live. And I said to her, no, people go to a place that you live in order to be safe. Her idea was, and I think this is a common reaction, she had to run. She had to find someplace safe. Wherever she was, she had to run to someplace different. So
I
that's
think a lot of people think that.
absolutely. So that's one of the reasons I say, don't make any huge changes. I mean, do the things that you think are important to do where you are, but don't panic and do something dramatic. Let it sink in, you know.
And one of the things that you've done that I've really enjoyed is you've created your own disorder about people's initial responses, at least, to the news that peak oil is happening, and we're not going, we're on a downhill, and we're not going to be having that same much. So tell us about the disorder and your flavor with that.
Well, I think one of the most upsetting things that people, the most upsetting thing to people when they first find out about peak oil is the fact that when they tell other people about it, other people are not receptive to it. And they meet them with statements like, that can't be right, maybe it'll be bad, but it won't be as bad as you say it is, and all of these sorts of batting back of the information without even looking into it, without even being curious about it. And so what I decided is, if we have a category of Debbie Downer, if we have a category of people who are buzzkills, as one of the contributors said, well, what do we talk about with the other extreme of people who are pathologically positive in a really fake way about the future? And so I called it Panglossian disorder.
Panglossian.
Right,
What does
which
that
is which is an unrealistic optimism about the future in the face of likely planetary and cultural collapse. So what I did is created a whole bunch of subcategories, in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way to help my contributors identify what they're going to face. Things like, oh, we'll take pig dung and we'll make fossil fuel out of it. Or, the Flintstonian, we didn't run out of, we didn't move out of the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. So you hear a lot of these really crazy responses. And so, basically,
they'll figure something
it out.
The alternatives will be made. I mean, part of what you're talking about here, going back, is not just peak oil. I mean, you just mentioned planetary collapse. Part of the thing that a lot of people think is, well, this is a problem, and they'll figure something out. Isn't that one of the biggest?
You will find people who are anti-establishment, who don't believe in corporations or big government, and they'll say things like, they'll figure it out. And you'll say, well, who are they? And they don't really they didn't go that far. They just assume, if I don't want to think about it, somebody else has to. Somebody else has to take care of it. And it's the big they,
Yeah.
So I think it's not just optimism, because people can be optimistic and they can be pro-social. They can do positive things. But when I talk about Panglossian disorder, I'm talking about it as a defense. They're acting like they're positive, but it's only as a defense against really contemplating negative things that they can't handle because they're overwhelmed. And I have a friend who's written about it, and her take is that they actually care too much, that they have such a profound emotional reaction to learning about these things that they have to put up this Panglossian defense, because otherwise it would just be too painful for them to actually process that on an intellectual level. The research studies have said that 80% of people believe that our planet is facing severe challenges, and that it has catastrophic outcomes. Only 14% of the surveys from public surveys say that it's not a problem. So people get it.
That's a big percentage.
It
That's bigger
is.
than I expected.
People get it, but I think the question is, then what do you do with it?
That's right.
And that question of then what do you do with it is what causes the Panglossian disorder. That's what I see.
it seems to me that a lot of people just want to just keep going on with their lives because this is big. I mean, we expect, the government will solve it, or I mean, businesses aren't going to just let themselves stop because we run out of it. I mean, it's really, what is it back to, that we feel like we're helpless, or we can only take care of this much, and you've got something that's going to affect the whole planet.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Here's the thing. I say, along with Catherine Austin Fitts, that you've got 71,000 communities in the United States and Canada, okay? All you have to do is worry about one of them, which is yours. And you have to take your house and you have to draw a 5-mile or a 10-mile radius, your choice, and you have to say, those people within that circle, they're my neighbor. And really have some meaning to the word neighbor. The old meaning of the word neighbor is when they needed something, you were there to give it to them. When they needed, when you needed something, you called on them.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
was a give and a take situation. And I think in this culture, we're really reluctant to ask for help because we know instinctively that the power position is offering help. But truly, that is a very healing position. The people who actually offer help are mentally healthier than the people who receive help.
Yeah, okay.
And when people are confused about that, I say, well, think about nursing homes. If you don't give a person a chance to give back and you keep helping them, you debilitate them. So one of the real challenges, I think, for a lot of middle-class folks that have always been able to function independently is to get comfortable enough to ask, even if they don't necessarily need it, to begin to ask other people to create a favor bank where I do for you,
Bank.
you do for me, I do for you, you do for me, and it begins to have that bouncing ball. And through that work, we can figure out if we're trustworthy or not.
Yes.
When I
yes.
help you, do you help me in the same way? Do you shirk your responsibilities,
Yes.
And that's where the word gossip got a bad reputation. And it's not really bad at all. Gossip is a way through a community where we tell each other the worth of the people
Oh,
around us.
interesting. Sure. Yeah, this person is, you can count. They'll be slow in giving it back to you, but they'll do it. Or, I mean, that's what gossip would say. Or
Or they always show
they'll
up for the
disappear.
potluck, but they don't bring anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically a check and a balance because in every community there has to be, at least traditionally, there has to be some payback to the idea that somebody's trying to freeload off the community.
Yeah.
And gossip
yeah,
is the way
yeah.
to,
Nice.
to add clarification to freeloaders.
You mentioned earlier that there's some danger in trying to figure out what's going to happen in the future, or some problem with people who are trying to say, I mean, what's it going to be like without oil, or with a far less oil, or an economic crash? So talk to us a little bit about sort of the future and the present, and how do people be with such hard news
Yeah.
of something that we aren't going to solve?
Well, it comes from some research that Gonzalez did about wilderness survival. And one of the things that he said that was really curious is that 6-year-old children and younger survive better when they get lost in the wilderness than children that are 7 and older. And the reason for that is that they don't have a preconceived notion or cognitive map about the world out there. So that when they're tired, they just find a place, say in a tree, and they go to sleep. When they're hungry or thirsty, they look for water. Whereas older children and adults have a cognitive map about the way things should be. So they press on over that mountain because they think that that may be where help will come from. That they don't trust, for example, a compass. If they think they're going in one direction and the compass tells them they're going in a different direction, they'll actually smash the compass.
Whoa.
So this notion, this cognitive map that we have about the way that the world should be becomes so strong that we stop actually seeing the changing world in front of us, and we ignore it and say it doesn't meet my cognitive map, it doesn't meet what I was expecting to see, so therefore it doesn't really exist. And that's, I think, the danger of being able to say, okay, let's predict, let's get an image, our image of what the future should look like, and then we'll backcast it and then we'll make that happen. That certainly has some value, but the limitation is that when the world is it's changing so quickly,
Right.
when it begins changing, we have that image in our head, maybe as a community, which is groupthink, really dangerous. As a group, we say it's going to be like this, and if that doesn't meet it, then that isn't really existing. That really isn't happening.
You know, what you're talking about is, you know, if you're going to be here right now, you're talking about, how do I say this? Dealing with what the situation is, rather than our pictures of it.
Right.
And we're a culture of people who are full of pictures.
That's right.
I mean, we've been fed pictures, movies and theater and television and all of that. We've got all these pictures, and we
Right.
either figure it's going to be a Mad Max scene,
Yeah.
or, you know, a dystopia of some sort. And I think we don't imagine there could be some good things coming out of this.
Yeah,
This
well,
kind of collapse.
you know, again, we don't admit how crazy the culture is right now.
Oh.
We live in a very insane culture. We don't socialize as often with our friends as we used to. We don't sit and have dinner with our families the way that we used to. And I'm talking about dramatic differences between how often we used to socialize in, say, 1970, how often we used to have dinners together as a family from 1970 to
Just
the
that
present.
short a period of time.
Dramatic shifts. So that as a result of that, we have clinically, I work with children who don't know how to play. They know how to play video games, but they don't know how to use their imagination in a fantasy-like play. If you send them out with other children without a video game, they don't know how to interact. And these are going to be major, major problems. So I think one of the advantages of a future that has less fossil fuel is that we'll be required to be more human. But part of the challenge is we'll have to start getting comfortable being around flawed human beings. And so one of the things that I talk about is we're all bozos on this bus. Let's get away from the idea that we have to be some high-level, perfect leader, high-level visionary, and let's accept the fact that people are annoying. And that's not a problem that people are annoying. The problem is that we expect that they shouldn't be annoying.
But Kathy, we've got all of these people who, I mean, we're watching shows in which everything gets resolved in an hour, or
That's right.
a movie, it's 2 hours, and these sort of polished veneers of what people are like, and that's what we have come to see we're supposed to be like, I guess.
Yeah. But the
And
problem
that's not
is
the way human beings are.
But the problem is the longer the time we spend in front of the computer, the longer the time we spend in front of any electronic entertainment device, a study from Stanford says that we become more socially isolated and we become more depressed. So it begins this loop where we get depressed and socially isolated, so we spend more time in front of our electronic devices and entertainment devices, and so we become even more socially isolated. So the only cure for any of that is to actually start interacting with people and learning the social skills that we've lost over time.
And lost quickly. I'm just sort of
Yes.
aghast at how quickly.
Yeah. The average family in 1970 had dinner 5 times a week. The average family today has 2 to 3 times a dinner for a week. Wow. Yeah. And we used to socialize in the 70s. We used to socialize 14 to 15 times a month. And by 1990, and I'm sure it's even less now, it dropped down to 8 times a month.
Yeah. I bet
So we're
it's
not talking
less.
about
Yeah,
a small shift
yeah.
socially.
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah.
dramatic.
It's sort of gone in parallel with that electronic increase, right?
Exactly.
We got computers in.
We stopped
we'll stop
talking.
to the people.
Yeah.
It reminds me that some of the folks that are working on, well, what do you do about peak oil, working in their communities like you're talking about, it occurs to me that there aren't very many in that generation that you're talking about. It's like they don't know how to work in groups, or aren't used to doing it. I don't know.
Are you talking about younger people?
I'm talking about younger people.
Well, I think there's a couple things operating. One is, and I get letters from 20-year-olds. And the thing I think that a lot of middle-aged boomers don't understand is that 20-year-olds are living it. We're thinking about it, but they're already living it. They can't buy houses.
Yes,
They have
yes.
to live in communal groups. So in many, many ways, they're already socializing in a very dramatically different way. They're living without cars, so they already have to know what the bus system is like. So despite the fact that, in some ways we see them more removed and more isolated, I think that the economic times are such that they're really being pressured to connect and to socialize,
Actually, that's true. We taped a wonderful show with two households of 20-somethings, and they'd taken the fence down between and were growing gardens and doing shared projects. And it's like they were already living in community right where they were, renting
Yeah.
renting
Oh,
these
yeah, yeah, yeah.
houses, right?
Yeah.
With one car amongst 12 people. I mean,
Absolutely.
so I see what you're saying, and
Yeah.
maybe
It is a paradox, but I think it's true that the boomers see that when 20-somethings write me, what they say is, I read your site, and a lot of people who are writing seem to be older. They're talking about getting solar panels. They're talking about insulating. Well, all those are good ideas, except I don't own a house. I have $60,000 in student loan debt. I'm just trying to get by. I'm trying to figure out what I can do without having those kind of resources.
Yes,
And they can't
yes,
even see their
yes.
youth as an advantage,
Yes.
which is what I try to remind them of. To this day, I could tell you a handful of middle-aged people who have property who would love to have young families coming and
Exactly.
living with them
Exactly.
to bring life to the place again, because you're aging. You don't have the enthusiasm, the energy level that you had in your 20s, and you really see the value of
Yeah.
youth in a
I
very
think,
different way.
I think we're going to see a lot of that. I think so.
Yeah.
We've got about 5 minutes left. What haven't we, the million things that we haven't covered here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that I really felt was important is to talk to mental health professionals, because I really don't want mental health professionals to pathologize people who first learned about peak oil. I mean, we may have maladaptive ways of reacting to it, but the fact is, it's psychological terrorism to say to somebody, you are reacting in a pathological way, when the way they're reacting is perfectly appropriate given the severity of the threat or the actual circumstances that are happening to them. So I'm really a big advocate for not pathologizing. I don't use post-petroleum stress disorder when I describe that reaction. I don't want anyone to say that the reaction to peak oil is by itself a pathology, because it isn't. The emotional distress that people are feeling, the shock, the anger, the sense of overwhelm, all of these things are completely understandable, and we need to start normalizing them, because paradoxically, the more we actually normalize those upsetting reactions, the way that we then begin to calm down. It's like the Bob Dylan song that says, I froze to the bone in New York town, and then I heard it was the coldest winter in 27 years, and I didn't feel so cold then.
Yes.
So we have to begin to
Yes.
say, oh yeah, you felt shocked? Uh-huh. Did you have problems sleeping? Oh, me too.
Yes.
Oh, and then did you just start
Yes.
doing all this crazy stuff? Yeah, that's typical.
That will help a lot for people to be assured that we all go through that. I mean, when
We do.
it's like when you start to realize this world isn't going to be at all like.
The next 20 years are not going to be anything like the last 20. Yeah, absolutely, as Chris Martenson says.
And we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. We just know that we need to be paying attention, and you're not crazy for feeling panicky at times.
And we have to manage our anxiety. Anxiety is not a problem, okay? We have to live and get comfortable, because we're going to feel enormously anxious, and our job is to figure out how do we manage it instead of how to get rid of it. Because we're a culture that has little tolerance for sadness. We call it depression. We have little sadness for anger. We call it rage. And we have very little tolerance for anxiety. We want to treat it psychopharmacologically. And we're not going to be able to do that in the future. We have to say to ourselves, Yeah, I feel anxious. So what are my options? How do I manage it?
How do we be with what we're feeling? I mean, our culture has been not
Just sitting
doing
with it.
that.
You know, a lot of it is just sitting with it and being able to talk with people about it and recognize, you know, we're all bozos. So not to be so defensive and say to ourselves, oh, I can't share that with anybody because they'll think I'm a bozo. Well, you know what? You are a bozo. So, you know, don't worry about them thinking that.
That's really reassuring.
You know.
It's like, because we got, you know, it's like you don't have to be the expert and you don't have to have answers.
No, you don't. You
Because
just have to be human. A flawed human like us all.
and get used to being with other flawed humans.
Right.
And we have to learn
Being
how.
annoyed by them.
Yeah.
Just kind of just enjoying that all of us are flawed and we can get annoying, and yet we still live within that 5 or
Yeah.
10-mile radius. So we're neighbors. So we have to get along. We
And you
have to
know, it
learn
strikes
how to
me
get along.
that, you know, we have a neighbor who people would call redneck. He's been in those woods a long time. You know, he hunts every fall. We don't do any hunting, but I know that if we had some challenge that we needed, he would be there for us. Even
Strange
though we're
bedfellows, I say.
Yeah.
You know, I have a neighbor, and he says, I don't believe in the global warming. And I say, you don't believe in it? He goes, no. I say, why? What's the deal? He says, I'm not using less electricity. I don't care what you say. I say, well, what's your electric bill? He said, $12. This guy is so cheap. Now we'd call him sustainable today,
Frugal,
right?
right,
Yeah,
sustainable.
Yeah, sustainable, green, that he won't use an answering machine because he doesn't want to waste the electricity.
He's already there.
He's a strange bedfellow. Do you see what I'm saying? But he's not the problem.
Yes. Yes.
He's not
yes.
the problem.
Right.
He's my neighbor, and I am going to have a relationship with him and do.
And he's teaching you stuff how to do it too.
Well, he
in
goes
some
out and
sense.
picks greens, and he makes a tonic in the spring.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway,
Strange fellows, bozos on the bus.
we're all bozos on this bus. We
And-
all will be bumping in and having strange bedfellows on this ride. And
Thanks for reassuring us that we're not crazy. You know, that our responses are. We'll go through phases.
or maybe
with
we need to
that.
be a little bit more comfortable being the crazy we are.
Kathy, that's great. I'll join your. Yeah, right. We'll be crazy together. I'm fine with that. Thank you for joining me.
Crazy
This
in
is
a
great.
fun way.
So tell us your website.
www.peakoilblues.com.
Peak Oil Blues with a peak shrink. Kathy McMahon, thanks for joining me.
Hey, it's wonderful being here.
You're watching Peak Moment, and no, you're not crazy, and no, you're not alone. Join us next time.